Three giant companies are moving in the same direction. What's the reason behind it?
A disturbance just moved through commercial aviation. Subtle, but impossible to ignore. Emirates, KLM, and Qantas each released major announcements, but together they form a pattern that feels almost orchestrated.
All three companies choose Airbus over Boeing.
Three giants stepping away from Boeing at the same moment should not happen naturally, not unless they saw something big enough and risky enough to force a realignment that's been building in silence for years. This isn't a fleet refresh, it's a warning. Three giants, one direction, the unmistakable pattern. Across global aviation, very few airlines carry the strategic weight of Emirates, KLM, and Qantas. Together, they operate more than 500 aircraft, shape traffic flows across the Middle East, Europe, Asia-Pacific, and influence over 200 international destinations. These are not just big airlines, they are structural pillars in three major aviation markets. And for decades, all three have held a strong bias toward Boeing for long-haul and narrow-body operations. This is exactly why their latest announcements triggered such a reaction inside the industry. Within a short window, all three carriers publicly committed to new long-term Airbus orders, signaling a coordinated pattern that almost never happens naturally. Airlines don't align by accident. They operate in different fuel markets, regulatory environments, and competitive landscapes. When three major carriers shift direction simultaneously, it typically indicates a shared concern deeper than simple fleet renewal. What makes this moment even more unusual is that these carriers belong to different alliances, fly different mission profiles, and compete in completely separate regions. Emirates dominates high-density long-haul traffic, KLM anchors Europe's transfer network, and Qantas operates some of the world's longest routes. Their needs don't overlap, yet their decisions suddenly do. Qantas announced its Project Sunrise aircraft selection in December 2022. Emirates placed additional A350 orders in 2023. KLM confirmed its Airbus narrow-body and wide-body orders in 2023. When carriers of this scale move toward one manufacturer at the same time, it reshapes training demand, supply chains, resale values, and future aircraft development priorities. So before looking at each airline's specific decision, the real question emerges: what did these three carriers see at the same time that made them shift away from Boeing after decades of loyalty? The first crack appears. Emirates operates one of the world's largest Boeing 777 fleets and has been a cornerstone customer for Boeing's wide-body programs for decades. To understand the gravity of this shift, look at Emirates' track record. In 2014, the airline canceled its entire Airbus A350 order. That's 70 aircraft gone overnight. At the time, the message was unmistakable. Boeing's wide-body roadmap aligned better with Emirates' long-haul expansion strategy. This was Boeing's victory lap. Emirates was their trophy client. And for nearly a decade, Boeing's 777 and 777X programs were positioned as the backbone of Emirates' next-generation fleet. But then something changed. In 2019, Emirates walked back into Airbus's arms with a fresh 30 pieces of A350-900 order at the Dubai Air Show, later adjusting this commitment. The airline subsequently placed additional A350 orders in 2023. At first, the industry thought this was a hedge, just a strategic insurance move. But then the repeat orders came, and the tone shifted. Emirates wasn't hedging, it was repositioning. The airline began leaning toward Airbus platforms as a necessary part of its next growth cycle. And that is the first red flag. Emirates does not reposition unless forced by a deeper operational or structural concern. The Boeing 777X, originally scheduled for delivery in 2020, has been delayed multiple times. The program was postponed to 2023, then 2024, with certification continuing into 2025. For Emirates, which operates 119 Boeing 777 aircraft and had planned to use the 777X as a replacement, these delays created significant fleet planning challenges. Emirates needed the 777X to fuel its long-haul dominance. Those delays disrupted route planning, limited expansion, and forced Emirates to rethink capacity distribution. Qantas, the radical overhaul that rewrote an entire future. If Emirates' shifting toward Airbus raised eyebrows, Qantas took things a step further and did something that sent a deeper shock through the industry. Qantas didn't just diversify, it didn't balance its fleet, it rebuilt its entire future around Airbus, from domestic operations to its most ambitious long-haul project ever. When a national carrier with more than 60 years of Boeing loyalty suddenly resets its strategy, it signals that the usual assumptions about manufacturer reliability no longer hold. Qantas historically operated significant Boeing fleets, including 737s for domestic routes and 747s for international service, maintaining this Boeing focus for several decades. That's why the industry was stunned when Qantas replaced the backbone of its domestic fleet, the Boeing 737 and 717, with 20 Airbus A321XLRs and 20 A220-300 aircraft. This wasn't a minor refresh, it was a complete reset of the airline's operational foundation. But the shock grew even larger when Qantas announced that its most important strategic project, Project Sunrise, would be built entirely around the Airbus A350-1000. Project Sunrise is not a typical route launch, it is a global aviation milestone. In December 2022, Qantas ordered 12 Airbus A350-1000 aircraft for Project Sunrise, with options for 12 more. The Sydney-London route covers approximately 17,800 kilometers and will take around 19 to 20 hours non-stop, making it one of the world's longest commercial flights. For flights this extreme, the aircraft must be reliable, efficient, and delivered on time. Qantas evaluated Boeing's proposal, which was centered around the 777X, and walked away. The fact that Qantas chose Airbus for such a mission-critical program is not simply a vote for better performance. It's a vote for predictability, trust, and stability, and that's where the deeper mystery begins to show. Long-range route planning is sensitive to delays. Any uncertainty in aircraft readiness threatens revenue projections, crew planning, regulatory approvals, and marketing campaigns. Qantas executives could not risk tying the future of the airline's global identity to an aircraft program with shifting schedules. Even small delivery uncertainties can throw multi-year planning off track, and Qantas had no intention of anchoring its flagship project to unpredictable timelines. Airbus, at this moment in history, provided something Qantas valued more than loyalty: dependable delivery windows and proven technical consistency. The A350 program demonstrated stable production, strong range performance, and efficient fuel consumption, essential traits for a project that pushes aircraft to their limits. But beyond this practical reasoning is a quieter, more telling shift. By choosing Airbus for both its domestic fleet and its longest flights, Qantas effectively aligned its workforce training, maintenance tools, simulator programs, and technical operations with Airbus's ecosystem. Once these systems are in motion, reversing them becomes a long and costly process. So Qantas didn't just change suppliers. It began building a future that assumes one manufacturer will be more stable and more dependable than the other. This wasn't a simple fleet purchase. It was a strategic realignment, and one that suggests Qantas saw risks on Boeing's horizon that the public had not fully connected yet. The quiet defection. If Emirates caused concern and Qantas caused shock, KLM caused confusion, the kind that only happens when a deeply loyal airline quietly breaks a decades-long relationship without making any noise about it. KLM is one of the oldest airlines in the world, a carrier built on stability, heritage, and structured decision-making. Unlike Emirates and Qantas, KLM doesn't make headline-grabbing leaps. It moves carefully, methodically, and with a strong bias toward whatever has historically worked. And for more than 50 years, what worked was Boeing. This is why the industry did a double-take when in November 2023, KLM, the airline whose long-haul and narrow-body fleets were overwhelmingly Boeing, announced a sweeping replacement of its aging 737s with the Airbus A320neo family, paired with new A350 widebodies. Unlike Emirates and Qantas, which made high-profile announcements, KLM's order received less media attention. KLM's fleet was one of Boeing's strongest European footholds. The airline helps anchor the SkyTeam alliance, influences European aviation trends, and operates out of Schiphol, one of the continent's most important hubs. The expectation, ultimately shared by analysts, suppliers, and Boeing itself, was simple. KLM would stick with Boeing's 737 MAX for narrow-body renewal and continue relying on Boeing widebodies for long-haul operations. That was the logical path, the predictable path, the path that required the least disruption. But that isn't what happened. Instead, KLM bypassed the MAX family entirely and moved toward Airbus platforms. The reasons weren't shouted publicly, but they were clear to those watching closely. The 737 fleet was aging fast, maintenance costs were rising, replacement was overdue, And the MAX program, still managing certification complexities and production slowdowns, didn't provide the delivery stability KLM needed. The move wasn't just about new aircraft. It was about choosing which manufacturer KLM believed could support its next era of European and intercontinental operations. Choosing Airbus for both narrow-body and wide-body needs meant something deeper. KLM was repositioning its entire operational infrastructure. That includes crew training footprints, maintenance systems, part suppliers, simulator transitions, and long-term planning models. Once those systems migrate to Airbus, reversing them becomes a multi-decade challenge. And this is where the quiet nature of KLM's decision becomes its most revealing feature. Airlines typically celebrate major fleet changes. KLM did not. It made its switch almost silently, which is often what happens when a carrier wants to avoid sparking speculation about the confidence levels it holds toward its previous supplier. Taken alone, KLM's move looks like a simple fleet refresh, but alongside Emirates and Qantas, it becomes something else entirely, another piece in a pattern pointing toward a deeper industry shift that is no longer avoidable. When patterns become proof. By now, the pattern is hard to miss. Emirates, Qantas, and KLM each made fleet decisions that, at first glance, look routine. But when you zoom out and examine the timing, scale, and context, a deeper alignment appears. These airlines did not abandon long-standing supplier relationships on impulse. They arrived at similar conclusions after years of managing uncertainty that gradually became harder to plan around. That uncertainty built over time and was visible in publicly documented program timelines. Boeing's 777X, originally targeted for entry into service around 2020, experienced multiple schedule revisions, eventually sliding toward a 2025 timeline. For airlines that plan networks 5 to 10 years in advance, those shifts mattered. Aircraft deliveries are tied directly to route launches, crew qualification cycles, simulator availability, and capital planning. When delivery windows move repeatedly, the risk spreads across the entire operation. At the same time, the broader environment added pressure. The COVID pandemic disrupted supply chains, delayed certifications, and strained manufacturing capacity across the industry. Regulators introduced tighter oversight standards, lengthening approval timelines for new aircraft variants. In that environment, airlines became less willing to base long-term strategies on programs still navigating certification and production recovery. Against that backdrop, Airbus programs followed more established trajectories. The A350 entered service in 2015 and had accumulated millions of flight hours across multiple global operators by the time these fleet decisions were made. The A320neo family had become one of the most widely deployed narrow-body platforms in service, offering airlines a deep pool of operational data, trained crews, and maintenance experience. With certification of the A321XLR in 2024, airlines gained access to a long-range narrow-body option that was already approved, defined, and entering production. Seen together, these timelines help explain why decisions across 3 regions began to align. The airlines did not coordinate with one another. They evaluated their options independently, using the same publicly available program milestones, certification statuses, and delivery outlooks. What emerged was not coincidence, but convergence, a shared response to prolonged uncertainty, and a growing preference for aircraft programs that were already certified, producing, and operating at scale. That is what makes this moment notable. Not because one manufacturer struggled or another succeeded, but because multiple airlines reached the same conclusion at the same time, under different market conditions and regulatory regimes. When that happens across continents, it signals an industry recognizing a broader structural shift, one shaped less by legacy loyalty and more by timelines, maturity, and operational certainty that can actually be planned around. The truth beneath the announcements. This is the point where all the pieces finally connect. Emirates shifting toward Airbus, Qantas rebuilding its entire future, and KLM quietly breaking a 50-year pattern weren't isolated events. They were symptoms of a larger truth that the aviation industry has known internally for years, but rarely states publicly. These 3 announcements didn't just open a new chapter for Airbus, they exposed a decade-long decline inside Boeing that is now impossible to hide. Apparently, Boeing has lived through a lost decade, and these airlines' decisions made that crisis visible to the world. The evidence didn't come from press releases or leaked memos. It came from behavior. Airlines reveal their true assessment of a manufacturer, not through words, but through purchases. Emirates, Qantas, and KLM all reached a point where they could no longer trust Boeing's delivery timelines, production stability, or long-term development progress. And when airlines stop trusting your timelines, they stop trusting your future. Now, let's break down what lost decade means in real terms. For over 10 years, Boeing has struggled with repeated production setbacks, engineering turnover, certification complications, and program delays. The 777X slipped years behind schedule. The MAX crisis created global grounding, regulatory scrutiny, and long-lasting uncertainty. Supplier relationships weakened, manufacturing consistency fluctuated, and Boeing, for the first time in its modern history, stopped launching new clean-sheet aircraft while Airbus moved ahead with entire new platforms. Airbus didn't just improve its planes, it improved its dependability. The A350 matured into a fuel-efficient, long-range flagship. The A320neo family dominated narrow-body demand. The A321XLR created a new segment airlines had been begging for. Airbus delivered on timelines Boeing couldn't match, and this contrast became too visible for major airlines to ignore. But here is the part that almost barely makes the news. These airlines didn't just buy Airbus aircraft. They locked themselves into the Airbus ecosystem. We're talking shifting pilot training, shifting simulator programs, maintenance operations, spare parts pipelines, engineering tools, and operational planning models. Once these systems move to Airbus, backtracking becomes a multi-billion-dollar effort. In aviation terms, that means it rarely happens. So these airline decisions aren't temporary, they are generational. Emirates, Qantas, and KLM weren't just reacting to short-term delays. They were making long-term structural decisions based on a belief that Airbus is now the more stable, more reliable, more future-proof manufacturer. And that is a verdict with 30-year consequences. The shockwaves yet to come. These fleet decisions will have several implications for the aviation industry and passengers, because these announcements aren't the end of the story. They're the trigger. The shockwaves from these decisions are already spreading across the aviation world, and the consequences will shape everything from ticket prices to global route maps to Boeing's long-term survival. The first ripple effect is route transformation. Airbus aircraft like the A350 and A321XLR give airlines new flexibility. The A350 lets carriers launch ultra-long routes with lower risk and better fuel burn. The A321XLR allows long, thin routes that don't justify a wide body, meaning more non-stop flights to secondary cities. Qantas's Project Sunrise is the clearest example. Sydney-London and Sydney-New York non-stop flights were impossible with older aircraft. Now they're real. And once passengers experience direct flights that cut hours off travel time, expectations shift across the industry. The second ripple is changed passenger economics. Airbus aircraft operating at lower fuel burn and higher efficiency give airlines better margins. Some airlines will use that margin to reduce fares. Others will reinvest it in cabin upgrades. Either way, travelers benefit from the new generation of aircraft entering the market. The A350 features cabin pressure equivalent to 6,000 feet altitude compared to 8,000 feet in older aircraft, larger windows, and higher humidity levels. The A350's quieter cabin, better humidity, and wide seats redefine long-haul comfort standards, forcing competitors to adjust or fall behind. Then comes the third, which hits manufacturers and suppliers. When three major carriers move into the Airbus ecosystem, simulator companies, training centers, maintenance vendors, and spare parts suppliers recalibrate around Airbus demand. This moves capital, jobs, and long-term infrastructure away from Boeing-heavy regions. Once these systems shift, they rarely shift back, meaning Airbus gains structural influence beyond simple aircraft sales. The financial and insurance recalibration follows closely. It is true that banks and leasing firms prefer predictable assets. If Airbus aircraft maintain strong demand and Boeing faces ongoing uncertainty, financing terms will tilt toward Airbus. This affects interest rates, lease rates, and valuation models for decades. Boeing will feel this pressure most sharply if more global carriers follow the same path. This is where Boeing's strategic response finally comes in. Boeing continues working towards 777X certification and has maintained that it remains committed to its aircraft programs, though the company faces competitive pressure from these high-profile airline decisions. And the final ripple, the one that determines the next era of aviation, is industry momentum. Aviation shifts slowly until it doesn't. Once enough major players commit to an ecosystem, everyone else starts to follow. Emirates, Qantas, and KLM were not random cases. They were the first cracks in a structure that has been under pressure for years. This is the new reality. Airbus is rising into the dominant operational platform of global aviation, and Boeing must now fight not just for market share, but for relevance in a world that changed faster than anyone expected. I guess the real question now is, who moves next? Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.